This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host, researcher and entrepreneur, Olli Tikkanen.
Welcome everyone. We have an interesting episode as we are having a special guest. Normally we have researchers, but this time we have a political correspondent of British daily newspaper, The Guardian. During his work time, our guest is covering the UK politics, but in his free time he has written a highly acclaimed book called The Miracle Pill, Why a Sedentary World is Getting It All Wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest, Mr. Peter Walker. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, great to have you. And basically, majority of listeners of this podcast are researchers. So what points you would like to highlight from your book that researchers maybe are not aware of?
I mean, I'm sure pretty much, whatever thing I mention, there will be researchers who know something about it. Because the whole thing about my book is it just puts it all together almost. I mean, I can certainly talk about the things that surprised me most. I mean, the one I mentioned earlier, I was surprised at how enormous, how significant ill health due to physical inactivity is, and just the sheer number of people who die from it every year. And I was interested in the fact that it's not really talked about much. And I guess, the difference is it's not obvious. I mean, coronavirus is direct and happens quickly. If you catch it and you're going to die from it, it's going to happen almost certainly within a few weeks. Whereas, if you're 20 years old and you get a desk job and then spend your evenings watching Netflix, you might not feel the health kind of problems for 20 or 30 years. And those will be indirect ones. So it's not kind of sexy in that way. And even like people being overweight, it's not obvious. You can't look at someone and tell that they're inactive. So I found that really, really interesting. The other area I thought is something that politicians certainly need to pay a lot more attention to is just, the impact on not just health services, but adult social care, older people's social care of not people dying, early from inactive living, even though that's obviously very, very tragic, but the parallel problem of people living for years or decades with this kind of series of interlinked problems. So, it's quite common to have, because I spoke to doctors about this and they were saying they'll quite often have people in their 50s or 60s coming in with type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, various other things. And all these things cost a huge amount. And, the idea we have this situation where the NHS in England, which is, this kind of sacred part of our life, might not be viable in its current form in like 20 or 30 years. People aren't really talking about that. The other really, really interesting things that I found was the debate about sitting down. I mean, that's slightly better known. But one of the things that I did was I actually borrowed a kind of research grade activity tracker. There's a Danish company which makes them for kind of lab tests. They normally kind of sell them, by the kind of dozen or 50 or stuff like that. But they sold me one. It's this little tiny tag that you attach to your leg, and it communicates by Bluetooth to your phone and then to a website. And at the end of every day, it can give you this kind of chart of what you've been doing. And I wore that when I was still doing my day job before COVID kind of came. And, even though I'm in general quite active, it was quite shocking to see, particularly in the afternoons, I could be sat down for 2 or 3 hours at a time without a break, just, typing. That was interesting. I was really interested, also quite alarmed in the idea of inactivity amongst younger people and how bad that is. That the UK stats are, it's something like 4 in 10 adults don't meet the kind of minimum activity guidelines. But for children, it's about 80% don't. And that's obviously a really, really, bad thing. This is when they should be laying down bone density and, building up their cardiovascular systems. And with that activity tracker, I got my son, who's 10 now, who was 9 at the time, to kind of go undercover in the school that he's in. He wore it under his school trousers. And then wore it at a weekend, and I could compare how much he was made to sit down in school with what his normal kind of lack of sitting down is. And it was quite shocking. His school's very good, but it's a lot of their time they're sitting down to learn. And it was interesting to compare that with countries like Slovenia, Finland, and various others who are actually thinking about this and are kind of making efforts to get kids more active. I could go on, and I'm sure amongst your listeners, everyone, there'll be someone who'll go, oh yes, I knew all about that. But as a kind of whole, I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. So you tested your activity before COVID when you were still going to the press conferences and so on. What was the inactive parts of your day? Was it writing the articles, or where did the inactivity came from?
The inactivity is almost all through the job, just having to sit down at a computer and type. I mean, my day was mixed because, when I'm going into Parliament, which is where my normal office is, I go by bike just because it's the easiest and quickest way for me to do it. And that's about a 3-mile round trip. So that gives me, a good 40 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity every day, which is, plenty for what I need. And the weird thing was, I actually walked perhaps a bit more than I thought. And it's partly because Parliament is such a strange place. Everything's spread out a lot. So even to just go and get a coffee, I have to kind of get up, walk down about 4 flights of stairs, go down this very kind of long outdoor corridor, up some more stairs, etc., etc. So I was doing, easily 10 or 12,000 steps a day. The worrying thing was just the fact that the amount of sitting down, it could be easily, counting the evenings as well, 7 or 8 hours a day. And the thing which I knew less about, which, I learned about talking to people, is the particular dangers of just uninterrupted sitting time, which is, quite well known, that even if you are going to sit down and write a story which will take 2 hours, the important thing is to try and get up every 20 minutes and even just walk around the room that you're in, just do anything. Just don't let your legs, particularly the big muscles in your legs, not do anything for a long, long time. So that slightly changed me. I got into kind of, not when I was still working, but when I was writing the book, particularly when I was writing the chapter about sitting down, I got slightly paranoid about how much I sat down, and I didn't have a standing desk, so I just balanced my laptop on tops of piles of books and things like that.
Yeah. So how was the process of writing book? You had the day job. Did you do it in the evening time? How was the whole process of getting the book out?
I did the research during whatever time I had with the day job. So I would quite often just say to my colleagues, I've just got to nip outside for a phone call for like 10 or 15 minutes. And I'd just be speaking to a professor in America or, somewhere like that. But I was quite lucky that the Guardian who I work for has a system where you get a sabbatical every 4 years, which is 4 weeks. And I had one coming up. And I took an extra week. So I had 5 weeks off. And I did the bulk of the writing then. I mean, I'm a journalist, so I'm used to writing reasonably quickly. So I had all the research ready, and I basically just sat and did, 6 or 7 hour days and wrote as much as I could. And I got the bulk of it done then. Then there was a period of, in evenings and stuff like that, going over the chapters, checking them and, things like that. But partly because it was the second book I'd written, I'd found it slightly easier. I knew how to plan things a bit more.
Yeah, so quite fast process if you wrote most of it in 5 weeks.
I'd written 2 chapters in advance because the publishers wanted to see a couple of chapters because it was a slightly kind of, it wasn't a book subject they knew much about. They wanted to know, well, actually before I had a publishing deal, my agent was saying, write a couple of chapters just so people can see what it's going to be about. So, that helped too. I had 2 chapters, I changed them a reasonable amount, but the bulk of it was there.
Yeah. And you said that you had done the research before. How much did you need to do research? How many people did you talk to, and how much did you collect research papers?
I mean, the trajectory for any book like this is always, both times it happened to me, I start out and think, oh, this is, completely interesting. This is great. And then I have about a week of thinking, I'm never ever going to get enough information. I don't know enough about it. And then, you spend months gathering the information. Then you realize you've got far too much you can possibly fit into a book. So it's a question of, working out what the interesting things are. And it was a kind of ongoing process. I mean, I spoke to, 60 or 70 or so people, overall, maybe even more, ranging from politicians to academics to people who run charities to, people with all sorts of interests. I read hundreds of research papers, and, some of them I read a long time in advance, but some, literally as I was writing the chapter, I thought, I wonder if there's a paper on this. And there's some I found, quite late. I'm incredibly lucky to be living in an era when research papers are quite easy to get. And as a journalist, if some of them, you need to pay for normally, I was usually able to email the press offices for the publishers, for the company that has them up, and say, I'm a journalist, I'm writing a book. Can I have a login, or can you send me these papers? And most people would. There were two papers I had to get from the Bodleian Library in Oxford because they did not exist. They're ones from like the 1970s. So I had to email someone there, and they, for £10, they found it and scanned it and sent me a copy. Apart from that, I went on a few kind of research trips. I went to a hospital to spend a day there with two doctors who kind of are consultants in general medicine. So they get to see a lot of the people who come in with the inactivity related stuff. And, that was really easy to get to because that's King's in South London, which is literally a 5 minutes walk from where I live. But I went to Slovenia to meet lots of people about how they kind of deal with inactivity. I went to Finland. I went to Denmark to see Jan Gehl and also to do other stuff like that. I was actually lucky. I got pretty much all the trips done before kind of the advent of COVID. There were a couple more I was going to do, which I couldn't do. So I had to just speak to people on the phone. But it was this kind of never ending process. It's like building up a jigsaw puzzle. It's just piece after piece.
Interesting. And you're a professional writer. What would be your advice for people who are thinking of writing a book? Maybe a researcher who's planning on a book. What's your advice?
I think the advice is to kind of know what your book is going to be. So, for example, with my first book, with the cycling book, it was really obvious it was going to be a book explaining the reasons why, more everyday cycling is a good thing. With this one, it was a bit more tricky to kind of put into words. So, for example, when you send a kind of proposal for a book, you have this thing of 300 or 400 words about, what the book is, who you are, why it's going to be interesting. And because I had sample chapters, I also had a kind of proposed outline of the book. And I found the structure really difficult because I, knew what I wanted to say, but didn't quite know how I wanted to do it. And it was actually my agent, Rachel Mills, who's really, really brilliant, who kind of thought about it and came back with a few ideas saying, well, hang on, you could structure it this way, in this chapter, what are you trying to say? And having someone else to kind of bounce off was really, really interesting. And, one of the things is too that having someone say, what's your book going to be about, and having to explain it in words is quite a useful thing, because if you find it difficult to explain, then no one's ever going to publish the book.
So know what your book is about is important point.
And know how you're going to structure it, know how you're going to write it, and just have a kind of plan. It's like kind of building the frame of a house almost.
Yeah, sounds good. And who should be reading your book? Who would you recommend it to?
Anybody. Anybody who's really interested in, not just, this specific subject of, why we live in this particularly inactive world, but even people with a general interest in scientific history, people who are interested in the design of cities, people who are, have a professional interest in getting people active. I like to think this is the sort of book that any reasonably intelligent, curious reader could pick up and would think, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I didn't know that. Because there's lessons for more or less everybody's life. I went into the protest thinking, almost feeling slightly smug, thinking, oh, I'm pretty active. I'll be perfectly fine. But then, I found out all the stuff about sitting down too long. And then, there's always things that you can kind of learn. But, even if someone is completely inactive and is going to stay inactive, at least it'll kind of let them think, well, this is a bigger problem than just me. So even if it just makes someone feel less guilty about being inactive, then that's good. And, the people who listen to your podcast, researchers and things like that, even if they know a lot about the particular subject, then who knows? It's possible they might find it interesting to see how it's presented in a kind of general interest way. But, I don't know if people read it and don't like it. I'm happy to hear that too.
No, I think people will like it. So where can people find it? And is it also as an audiobook? Where would you like to direct the people?
They can go to wherever they want. I mean, Amazon obviously has it if they want. I mean, in the UK, there's this organization website called bookshop.org, which is a kind of collection of local bookshops. So you can do internet orders depending on where you live. It's in hardback at the moment. It came out about a week ago. And there is also a Kindle edition, and there's an audiobook read by me. I was available and I was cheap. And that is available. So it involves listening to my voice for about 7.5 hours. And they're all available under the kind of usual places. So buy it wherever you feel most comfortable buying your books. Oh, actually, I should say that, I've actually had a few people who've been kind of tweeting me, emailing me saying that they've ordered it from, their bookshop in the kind of center of the town, the city where they live. And they've specifically walked to the bookshop to kind of pick it up because they, would feel guilty about driving to get a book about activity. I've had also, messages from people saying, is it okay to read the book lying in bed? So, it's definitely making people think.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you actually read the book by yourself. How was the process of reading your book for 7.5 hours?
It's quite long. I've got a lot of respect for kind of voice actors. I mean, for the first thing, it's quite physically grueling. I asked via Twitter just people about, what tips, and some people were saying you should never drink a milky drink because it makes your voice slightly phlegmy. And I made the mistake on the first day of having a coffee with milk, and it's perfectly true. So just, stick to apparently juice or water are the best things. The other thing is too that reading a book out and then reading a book on a page are quite different things. And if I ever write another book, I'd be quite tempted to read it out loud first of all, because you notice mistakes. So I noticed 3 or 4 tiny errors. By the time I was doing the audiobook, it was too late. The actual physical book had gone to print. So they'll have to wait, till the paperback comes out. But I also notice that when you read out sentences, if a sentence is too long or not very elegant, you really notice it. So, there were parts of it where, I was thinking, oh, that's really nicely written. But there are other parts where I was thinking, oh, I'd, do that differently again.
Yeah, that's a good point, that maybe reading it aloud would make the book better when you actually writing it.
Introducing Fibion Sense Motion, the beginning of a new era. Fibion Sense Motion is a cutting-edge, next-generation system that allows you to easily and remotely collect, store, and manage data. Our solution features a tiny, waterproof device that captures the sedentary behavior and physical activity data, a mobile app for automatic uploading of the data from the device, and a cloud service for managing the data. Even better, all collected data is GDPR compliant, and you have access to automatically analyzed variables of activity types and raw 3-axis accelerometer data. Discover the convenience and power behind our solution at sense.fibion.com. That is SENS.Fibion.com. Fibion, created by researchers for researchers.
And how long it took to read? Like, it was, the final version was 7.5 hours. How long did it take to record?
I was in the studio for 3 days. they booked me in for 3 days. You basically can't do too long. I turn up at about 10 or 11 and work till about 4, and by that point, you're really, really tired. So it's this quite small soundproof booth that you're in, and they had a kind of iPad or some kind of tablet with a book on it. So I could scroll, and I had a microphone like I'm sitting down now. And then on the opposite side of this kind of very thick glass was the producer who had their own copy of the book and would be completely silent for kind of ages and ages, but until I made a mistake, and they go, "Oh, you got that word wrong." So they were listening really carefully. And there were some complexities too, because there were some kind of, I don't know, names of kind of chemicals and, people's names who I'd quoted where I'd never actually said them out loud. So they had to kind of check on how they were said. They would just go on the internet, and there's certain sites which will tell you the pronunciation of certain words. There was a Brazilian academic who I'd talked to, but I'd never actually said his name. So they had to kind of go through this kind of Brazilian pronunciation guide as to how to say his name. So there's all sorts of interesting things.
Yeah. Sounds really interesting, and in a small booth. And I didn't know that there's somebody listening all the time, every word you say. Was it stressful to be like reading?
It is, because it's quite hard to go for more than a few sentences without making, a mistake. And if you do, you just stop, pause for 2 seconds, and then carry on, because obviously they edit it all. But, there'll be a period when I could get through maybe, half a page without making a mistake or hesitation or, stumbling over a word. And that felt really good. But there were some times where I'd have to, read a sentence 4 or 5 times. And even with ones that were quite complicated, do it in 2 separate parts. And it's just, reading things out loud in a very fluent way. There's a reason why professional actors are very good at it, because it's not very, it's not a straightforward thing. And if I did it again, I'd be much better at it. But, who knows if that'll ever take place again.
Yeah, I know quite a bit of not being able to say things correctly. Like, first of all, English is not my first language, and then doing sometimes recordings like now, for me it's 10 to 10 in the evening, and sometimes I'm doing an episode and a researcher starts to talk about something and I'm not an expert on the theme.
Yes.
And then there's a lot of new words and I'm like, oh, what was that? How do I pronounce it?
I know, it's very difficult.
For Finnish people, we don't have any rhythm in our talk. We always stress the first syllable. So for us, actually having the rhythm in different words, it's more challenging. So I'm sometimes struggling a lot.
Well, yeah, doing it in a second language is even more difficult. So I have a lot of respect for you doing that.
Yeah. So it's been really interesting discussions about your book. Is there some other things you would like to bring up into this discussion?
I guess the one thing that I would also say is that, one of the strange things about writing the book was I was writing it, in a period when so much was changing. I mentioned this before, that public health is not a particularly sexy subject. It's not one that, in previous times got talked about an awful lot. And, I planned this book quite a long time before COVID, and I'd planned to write it at, the time I was going to write it. And then suddenly it was very, very strange that, you were in this position where scientific advice to government was always this kind of thing that took place in the background that no one ever really kind of noticed. And then you were suddenly having press conferences where you'd have the Prime Minister in the UK giving press conferences, daily with kind of the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, who were previously very, very kind of unknown people who were suddenly become, public figures. And people were talking about epidemiology and population-wide outcomes and stuff like that. And it was very, very odd. And, some of the discussions haven't really gone that far because, in the UK, at least, government ministers keep on saying, well, the COVID outbreak, particularly the very high death toll in the UK, has highlighted these public health issues the UK has got because, the research very much seems to indicate that coronavirus outcomes can be worse if people have type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or are overweight to a certain extent and things like that. And ministers have talked about trying to get the population more healthy in case there's a pandemic in the future. And yet we're at a point where, those decisions haven't been taken. So, the book is, a kind of work in progress almost. It presents the facts the way they are now, but it could go either way. I mean, I say this at the end of the book. We could have a thing where ministers, in all sorts of countries think, we need to do things differently. We have been interventionist with coronavirus. We can be interventionist with other public health issues. Or you might just have a thing where, people just go back to driving cars and they don't feel safe on public transport. So more and more people drive cars. And in the UK, certainly some of the temporary bike lanes, which were put in during coronavirus, have been taken out. So it's a kind of, ending on a kind of knife edge, really. No one knows which way it's going to
go. That's a really interesting point that you say that the first time the medical advisors are in the spotlight on a daily basis. And could it be that in the future they would be all the time in the spotlight if there's no pandemic going, but actually really advising the political decision making to guide people for more healthy lifestyle?
I think it's possible because certainly in the UK, I mean, it's happened in lots of countries, but, my experience in the UK that people have got used to the idea of scientific advice guiding what government ministers do. And, one of the strange things about it in the UK is that whilst lots of politicians' reputations have been, damaged, or their reputations are certainly mixed, the scientific advisors, for the most part, are viewed with a lot of affection. And it's interesting at the press conferences, you have this kind of very stylistic difference. A question will be asked to, a government minister, and they will give very much a politician's answer. They will answer what they want to. But I think when scientists get asked a question, they get used to, their habit is to answer it as factually as they can. And I think for a watching public, that's quite a contrast. So I think people quite like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you said about the medical advisors, and you were probably reporting the things when the COVID was starting. And I remember I was looking quite a bit of BBC News at the time. And I think the slogan was like, we will do the right thing at the right time. And I was really horrified. Like, no, you might be doing the right thing, but you are not doing it the right time, or you are not doing it at all. How did you feel at that time?
I mean, it's such a confusing time that no one can really be sure. There was this kind of real sense of panic that things were going very slowly. And, government ministers will not admit it, but it's very, very clear that in lots of parts in the pandemic, the UK has acted, too slowly and not done enough, quickly enough, which is why, our coronavirus death rate is one of the reasons why it's, per capita, one of the worst in the world. And I don't know, it's as you say, the language can be a very frustrating thing. At, one of the kind of, during the early points of the coronavirus crisis, a lot of the time government's ministers will say, we're following the science. But it was this idea almost that science is this kind of unified view. And I think it's been quite an education for the British public to have, scientists being asked by journalists or members of the public, what do you think the government should do? And they say, well, it's not for us to say. We can present what the kind of options and what the possibilities and what the forecasts are. And we can say, if you do X, then Y might take place. But we can't tell you what to do. And, it's also been interesting hearing scientists explain that, scientists can disagree. There is no one unified view. And I think it's been quite kind of educational, really.
Yeah, and I think in the beginning they said that they are following the science, which was, in my opinion, ridiculous. It was clearly shown that they should do the actions right away, and they basically did nothing. So how do you think, who were the scientists in a way? Because I think they looked into it, and the scientists had actually or some scientific advisors have said that we don't need to do yet anything. So where did it go wrong in your opinion? Was it like, why did the science say so? Because if you studied the theme a little bit, you knew that it's an exponential curve that
Yes.
you really need to do right away. And I was really stressed that how can it go like this in a country which is highly educated, and I was really horrified. How did it go? So what do you think? What did go wrong?
I genuinely don't know, and there will be a public inquiry at some point which will go into it. I mean, the scientific aspect of it is interesting because, the records do show that some of the scientific advisors were, skeptical about the idea of mass testing, trying to kind of eradicate the virus as much as possible. And it's difficult because, you have, examples of other countries which have effectively closed their borders. And in the UK with, for example, such a high proportion of food coming in via freight, via sea, that would have always been very, very difficult. And, I think it's been an incredibly steep learning curve. And maybe I think, the inquiries might find that the planning that the UK had done for kind of pandemics in the past might have been the wrong thing. They might have modelled it on less infectious ones, maybe things like, the kind of Hong Kong type SARS, which are more dangerous, if caught, but less easy to transmit amongst the populations. But at the same time, you cannot separate the scientists from the politicians because they're in the same room together making the decisions. And the scientists would never, ever have been able to say, we insist you introduce lockdown now. Because this was something that, a lot of countries did it far too late. And some countries have arguably, done even worse than the UK. And I don't know, with Britain, I don't know, maybe there was a certain amount of complacency amongst, scientists, because amongst epidemiologists and things like that, the UK has always had quite a good reputation. A lot of that kind of work has come from the UK. And maybe they just thought they knew what they were doing and they were caught out by a pandemic that no one had ever really seen before in this particular form.
Yeah, and when you said that it's more contagious, it could be much more. So I think we were lucky that we were struck by this kind of, which is not that serious as many other diseases are. There's much more.
Well, it wasn't like SARS,
serious,
which had a death rate of 10% or 20% or something like that. So
yeah, and I think also is it reproduction number, or how do you call it?
Oh yeah, the R number, yes.
15 times R number, it might be 15 times more. So I think we were lucky that it happened.
We've had a practice run.
A practice run.
Well, a very tragic practice run, obviously. But
it is a really, really tragic one. But yeah, now we are going a bit more into the politics. What would be your final remarks for this very interesting episode?
Well, it would to kind of directly address your audience. It's the fact that, I don't know, I'm not a scientist by trade. In fact, because of the kind of craziness of the English, as it, is educational system, where you have to specialize really, really early. I haven't formally studied science since the age of 16, which is quite a long time ago. And so I'm not a scientist by kind of any means. But I was really, really impressed with how good in general researchers and scientists and experts are at communicating what they do. And they were all, very, very helpful. They were happy to talk. And a lot of them could explain things in a very, very eloquent way. And some of the studies are also just written really well. So I think it was quite heartening. And, we're in an era now when, science and its interaction with the public is going to be increasingly important, and the public are going to be much more ready for that. So, I think scientists should be proud of the way that they can do that and should basically carry on doing it.
Great. It was pleasure to have you in the podcast. I had a brilliant time talking with you, so really appreciate you taking the time for it.
It's a complete pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.